the Beatles. We have John Lennon, who's a singer-songwriter, vocalist, rhythm guitar. We have Paul McCartney, singer-songwriter, vocalist, bass player, and piano. Now, Stu Sutcliffe was the original bass player. We have George Harrison, singer-songwriter, lead guitarist. The original drummer of the Beatles, his name is Pete Best. Ringo Starr, the drummer that we know. We talk about the Fab Four as being John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. Brian Epstein, he was the Beatles manager. And George Martin is the guy that ran Parlophone, EMI Parlophone, signed the Beatles, and also made quite a few really cool, interesting suggestions on particular songs and albums, on certain things they could do artistically and musically. Let's talk about the stories of the members. John Winston Lennon, born in Liverpool, England, on October 9th, 1940. John's mother, her name was Julia. Julia was really happy, fun-loving, carefree. Within, about a year of John Lennon's birth, she left her husband. John Lennon's father, he was a ship steward, wasn't home that much, and so John was, really his Aunt Mimi, which was Julia's sister, and John's Uncle George. It really became kind of, those are the people that raised him pretty much. John Lennon was rebellious and iconoclastic, and he'd been known to, kind of be rough and gruff around the edges sometimes, and would push back on authority figures. John did like to read, though, and he would read, he'd write, create and write poems, short stories, drawings. He was kind of trying to find himself and figure some things out, and the whole short story and poem thing, it definitely starts to resonate and make sense when you really dig into all those lyrics. There was a impishness that kind of progressed through mischievousness, and this led to mild delinquency. He was rebellious. John was very outspoken, so much so that it probably got him in trouble in times. When John Lennon says, the Beatles are, more popular than Jesus Christ. That got a lot of people angry, for sure. We look at, say, around 1955, Uncle George passes away suddenly. John struggles with that and starts to become a burden on Aunt Mimi. John Lennon's grades, they start to drop. He gets way more rebellious and more troublesome. You move over to 1956, and you have John hears Elvis Presley, and he's mesmerized by Elvis Presley, and he's like, wow, man, this Elvis guy is, he's digging it. He's digging it for sure. And John gets a guitar, he gets a hold of something. At the time, the BBC declined to play rock and roll, and so it made it a real challenge for John or anybody to find, this Elvis Presley guy is incredible. Oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do now? All right, so there was an independent radio station. This is Luxembourg, if I'm saying that right. And John listened constantly, and he was able to hear all the rock kind of stuff that he wanted to hear. If you find older pictures of John Lennon, you'll see greasy hair, ducktail, a pointed slight of hair in front, maybe some tight drainpipe pants. John started really getting into different kind of music. Lonnie Donegan smash hit called Rock Island Line, really representing this whole skiffle style, it's a simple 3-chord style, and it features an instrumental lineup of guitar and or banjo. You have some homemade instruments like a washboard, play with the thimble-capped fingers, and then bass made from a broom handle, wooden chest, and a tightly strung wire. So it's some interesting kind of makeshift, things happening with that particular style, but it was captivating for a lot of people at the time. John organizes his own skiffle group. They call it the Quarrymen. John wants to call it Quarrymen because it's named after Quarry Bank High School. That's where John went to school. And so they played both skiffle and they played rock and roll. And this is probably July or so of 1957, they were playing at a garden party. And this is when one of the bandmates in the group, his name was Ivan Vaughan. Ivan Vaughan introduces John Lennon to his friend from the Liverpool Institute, and this guy's name is, you guessed it, Paul McCartney. Ivan is in the Quarrymen at the time with John Lennon and some others. Ivan is the guy basically in the middle. He's the connector. John Lennon and Paul McCartney haven't met yet. Once that connection is made, some serious sparks and magic awesomeness happens. Then at some point, Paul shows John what he can do and just starts throwing down like some Little Richard songs, and John's blown away. After several days, John does invite Paul to join the group. Paul McCartney is, he's got a little bit of a different upbringing. When we look at Paul McCartney, James Paul McCartney, he's born on June 18th, 1942. He really excels in, say, like English composition and art. He was very successful in school and academics and grades. And at around 14, Paul's family, it was a really heartbreaking kind of moment in the family because it was the death of Mary McCartney, Paul's mother. Paul McCartney loses his mom at 14, and they're all devastated. Paul's father, Jim, he had a society band in the 1920s. Paul's father's musical background, this is a huge influence on the McCartney home. Now, the skiffle thing I was talking about earlier, the skiffle rage, like it hit Britain pretty hard. And, Jim, this is his dad, Paul's dad, gets him a guitar. Paul starts imitating the vocal and guitar styles of Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, and the Everly Brothers. So these are big influences on Paul McCartney. Musicians, artists get inspiration from other artists. John was like a huge Elvis Presley guy. Paul McCartney was like Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Carl Perkins, Everly Brothers. But there's probably some of those that, John was pretty hip to as well. If we take a look at George Harrison. George Harrison, he's born February 25th, 1943. George meets Paul at the Liverpool Institute in around, I believe, 1954. Like John, George resented formal education, didn't do that great in school, and had that teddy boy look, kind of, sort of. George's mom gets him a guitar, and George starts teaching himself to play. The interesting thing about this part of the story is when you look at, okay, well, how did George even get into the group? What's the story behind that? The connector in this particular one would be Paul McCartney, because Paul and George are friends, but also Paul McCartney and John Lennon, of course, are good friends and already playing together in the band. But George isn't there yet. So Paul introduces George Harrison, to John and the group, and George shows a few patterns and things and just a few skills that he can do. And in the beginning, John looked kind of down on him, like a bit condescending, because at the time, George Harrison is 14 years old, and probably around that time, George was maybe a little somber and introverted, or maybe that's just the way like John saw him. But John tolerated George Harrison because he was Paul McCartney's friend, and of course he got into the band. And the real story is like Stu is the original bass player. There's a lot of talk in the history about Stu basically performing with his back to the audience. First of all, he was still learning how to play for a little bit, and this is before the Beatles, really. Stu and John, they're close, good friends, and Stu's actually not in the band yet. Stu's one of the most talented students at the art college. He's a very talented art student. He's gifted at art, but some would say Stu is a little bit antisocial. Stu looked and dressed and acted the part of like a counterculture brooding artist. So for many, it does kind of seem that it's a pretty good fit, good vibe that, him and John do become friends. Stu gets a bass guitar and he's determined to join John's group, but he didn't know how to play, like nothing, not at all. He did not know how to play. John doesn't even have to think about it. It's like, sure, yeah, join the band. They're really good friends, and hey, why not? Let's do it. There is a tragic accident where we lose Stu, and he passes away. Paul ends up switching to learn the bass and take over in that area. Well, they start off as like the Quarrymen, Quarry Bank High School, John and Ivan and a few other people, and then you end up, Ivan brings over, Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney brings in George Harrison. Stu is in that mix as well. Who's the person in the record books that actually came up with the idea of like naming? Well, it was Stu's. John and Stu are chilling. Stu says, "How about the Silver Beatles?" John thinks for a moment, and John's like, "Well, what if we try Long John and the Silver Beatles?" He's kind of fascinated with, I guess what you'd call wordplay, and we're going to just misspell this on purpose, and, I guess you maybe view it as, a punning on the word, possibly. But the Beatles, part of that conversation was both Stu Sutcliffe and John Lennon, they liked groups, say, like Buddy Holly and the Crickets, Little Richard and, Elvis Presley and the Everly Brothers, and Buddy Holly and the Crickets was a part of that too. The original drummer for the Beatles, Pete Best. When he got into the band, it was a pretty feel-good, kind of happy, situation. I want to say probably that Paul was a big hype on that, kind of hyping up, hey, we got to get this guy, Pete over here. And they did, and Pete did, play for a while. Pete Best does actually record songs with the Beatles, go on tour with the Beatles. One day, the manager's name is Brian Epstein. Brian, as the manager of the Beatles, has the tough job of asking Pete Best to come to the office one day and says, hey, I got some bad news for you. The guys want you out, and they want Ringo in. And, there wasn't much more conversation than that. The Beatles are touring, they're doing gigs, they're recording. Ringo's got his own band doing his own thing. People are getting to know each other. Like the whole band had already known like who Ringo was. They'd seen him do gigs and play, and they got to hang out with him, in between or after sets, whatever. So there's definitely that friendly vibe. So what's the stories on the internet that go around, or the Beatles felt like Pete didn't want to party after hours, or the band set is done and maybe Pete wanted to go home, didn't want to partake in the party hangs or whatever. Or maybe the other part of the story that goes around, well, Pete was getting all the lovely ladies, and they were all going to hang out with him or his table or whatever or something like that. And when it's possible that maybe John or Paul or maybe George, but yeah, that maybe there was a lovely young lady that they wanted to connect with, and Pete actually connected more with him. I don't know. Here's what I do know is that stories are stories, and it can be tough to figure out. Well, is any of that really true? Yeah, that's hard to know, but there are some stories that you might, run into. There's other stories and arguments. It's like, well, was Pete Best a better drummer? Was Ringo Starr a better drummer? For me, I don't really think about better. I just think about different. Honestly, I would just go listen to some of the tracks that, Pete played on. I could tell you what I think, but really what I think is it's kind of up to you. I mean, I think they're different. So I don't think in terms of better, worse. I don't think that way in terms of music. Isn't vibe important, in all walks of life and all periods? And I would say yes. I mean, you could be the best drummer in the world, but if it doesn't fit good with the other members, they have every right to say, yeah, we want him out of here. We want this other guy. Look, we're talking around. This is 1962. The Beatles bring Ringo over. Ringo gets that Beatles-style haircut. Ringo shaves his beard, and he says goodbye to Rory Storm. You have John, Paul, George, Ringo. You got Brian Epstein, who becomes their manager, and George Martin, EMI Parlophone, who signs them. In September of 1962, you got the Beatles recorded Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. The Beatles really lead the British invasion to the United States of America. And, when they're playing lands and they're about to go on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time, it's like it must have been a pretty wild airport scenario. You can watch the Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles, and it's just so much screaming and excitement and just energy of the awesomeness of it's like the Beatles were a hit before they got off the airplane, basically, in the United States of America. They lead, this whole British invasion. If we take a look at Yesterday by the Beatles, Paul McCartney, Paul does lose his mom. He's 14 years old. And if you listen to Yesterday, a lot of people do think it's about losing a loved one, mom, dad, boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. That is surely possible. Now, when you listen to the song for the very first time and you don't search up anything, Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, Yahoo, or I don't know, whatever you use, I always ask the same question when I do the stories behind music or the Beatles lectures. Like, well, what comes to your mind? If you never heard Yesterday, don't Google it, listen to it, and what do you hear? What comes to your mind? Now, in Yesterday, a lot of people have talked about there's a connection to Paul's ex, Jane Asher. He meets Jane before he writes the song, though, and this breakup doesn't really coincide with the song release. The plot twist is that Paul does write the song while he's living with his then girlfriend. Yes, you guessed it, it is Jane Asher. Now, although it's many years after Paul McCartney's mom passes away, because Paul's 14 when that happens, it is possible that yesterday is maybe him releasing his pain and grieving, maybe. Now, in an interview with Paul McCartney, he talks about how he woke up from a dream and wrote down the melody early in the morning, and the original lyrics were about scrambled eggs. And you can hear him straight up say that on YouTube. He says it. It's not an opinion. It's a fact. Well, we also know for sure that it's his song. He was worried about, oh my gosh, did I steal this melody? Did I hear it somewhere else and it just popped in my head and now I'm trying to come up with some lyrics? He had to ask people. Paul had to say, hey, do you know this? Is this really mine? It's one of those kind of things. Let's look at Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds for just a moment. A couple short and sweet things, because this song has gotten a bad rap for many, many years. Here's what I can tell you. With Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, according to, John Lennon, John's son Julian comes home. He's maybe 2-3 years old, and he comes home with a drawing. He drew something at school, brings it home, and the person in the drawing was Julian's friend, Lucy. And Lucy is in this drawing like floating in the sky. It's like all, pretty and colorful, and it's sparkly, jewels, diamonds, that kind of thing. And here we go, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds gets the bad rap of double entendre. You'll hear the history where they're talking about, just bad stuff and substances and all that business. But really, John's like, it's not about that at all. Now, what about Hey Jude? Hey Jude is one of these really popular songs too, and it's got a pretty big story. So Paul McCartney writes the song Hey Jude. He writes it for Julian, John Lennon's son, as a comfort song. He divorces his wife Cynthia and marries Yoko Ono. And you'll also see in a lot of the history where it's like John is like hanging out with Yoko before he's divorced from his wife Cynthia. Yoko Ono is a Japanese artist. So Paul McCartney wanted to have a song that was like a comfort song for the young Julian, and that was the whole vibe. I mean, there was one time where John Lennon's wife, she comes home, and John Lennon and Yoko are just chilling on the couch in bathrobes, not really acknowledging, Cynthia's existence. Sounds kind of weird, but it is another one of those stories that we hear about. Like, whoa, and what? No way! Like they didn't jump up, or it's like, well, man, did that really happen? Like, what is going on? But there's also the stories of like Yoko going to the studio, not only before they get married, but also going there and like wanting to actually critique and talk. And yeah, they didn't like that too much. That's why you'll see in the history books as well. It's like the Beatles broke up because of Yoko Ono. Well, I'm not going to get on that train, but I will say the band members definitely got frustrated with they didn't want to be critiqued, by John's new girlfriend and soon-to-be wife, and they weren't digging that. That definitely, what we can't say, it threw off the vibe, on any kind of touring or studio situation. So you'll see some of that. But the basics of Hey Jude is a comfort song for Julian, written by Paul McCartney. How about something like Blackbird? We're talking about the Beatles' White Album. At the time, they were very outspoken critics of black segregation in America. There's a few years earlier, the Beatles are touring before the White Album and before we hear Blackbird, and they had actually refused to play for segregated audiences in the United States. And, that caused an uproar. When we look at the mid-'60s, civil rights, it's unfolding. John F. Kennedy in the 60s, Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream. Like, it's happening. Like, things are moving forward in a much more positive, harmonious direction. But there's a lot of roughness to get there, a lot of rough and tumble for sure. Paul McCartney was really paying a lot of attention. He was really troubled by the treatment of, black Americans, African Americans. And Paul McCartney basically comes up with this ballad, and then he calls it Blackbird. And this was actually recently covered by Beyonce for her country album, Cowboy Carter. And Paul went to Instagram pretty quickly and is like, yeah, he's like praising and like, just really excited for Beyonce and that rendition of this iconic track. And you can check out the article about Paul McCartney and check out the Instagram with Beyonce. And this is Paul's words, exact quote from Paul McCartney. I am so happy with Beyonce's version of my song Blackbird. I think she does a magnificent version of it and reinforces the civil rights message that inspired me to write the song in the first place. Anything my song and Beyonce's version can do to ease racial tension would be a great thing and makes me very proud. And Isn't that what it's all about right there? That's just beautiful. So beautiful of Paul to say, and so beautiful and amazing. And kudos, Beyonce really did a wonderful, wonderful job. Don't forget about when you're listening to Yesterday that there's a string quartet. I think that this gets glossed over too much. And the whole string quartet thing on Yesterday was like, Paul wasn't digging it. John didn't really like the song. John Lennon wasn't digging it too much. And Paul was like, yeah, I don't know about this whole. He did react pretty negatively to the idea of a string quartet. And, this wasn't the first time that, George Martin, the guy that ran EMI Parlophone and signed the Beatles, had like these suggestions that, well, personally, I think are really, really cool. But like 9 times out of 10, the Beatles weren't feeling it. But also maybe even 9.9 out of 10, George was onto something. And it's like, well, how do you measure that? Where does all these numbers coming from? Well, here's what I can tell you. You're very close to the artwork that you create, whether it's painting, sculpting, music, dance choreo. You're very close to it. So it can be hard sometimes to for someone to say, hey, well, why don't you try this? And you're like, what are you talking about, man? I ain't doing that. That's ridiculous. You're like, what? Now, that's not what Paul said. That's not how he talks. The string quartet idea actually grew on Paul McCartney. Here's the difference maker, straight up. George Martin could physically play. He was a musician. He was an artist. When George had an idea for a song, he would just say, I have an idea. But he wouldn't just be talk. He'd show you. Let's try this. And he'd play it or write it down. Well, yeah, of course. Then then words become actions at that point, and actions speak louder than words. So while this is not the only time that maybe the Beatles got their feathers ruffled in terms of like, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Well, George Martin would say, well, check this out, and then they would try it and still kind of be maybe a little ambivalent. And from the history books, it seems like that when a lot of those ideas that George Martin had, like they got used. So kind of cool. And yeah, Yesterday, it's first released on the album Help, and it is one of the most covered songs. All right, so if we look at some of the albums like Please Please Me, 1963, Help and Rubber Soul, 1965, Yesterday and Today, 1966, Revolver, 1966, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, 1967, The Beatles' White Album, Abbey Road in 69, Let It Be in 1970. If we look at sampling of music, when you listen to In My Life, there's another one of those George Martin moments where he suggests an idea and the Beatles are like, I don't know. And then there's an instrumental break and you're going to hear a piano keyboard type solo. And so when you're hearing that keyboard solo, it's like Baroque or maybe Bach-ish inspired. And check that out. That might be kind of fun. If you were to watch the YouTube video on Eleanor Rigby, it's about a real person. Paul McCartney he's inspired. He was helping out an elderly lady. She lived alone. He got to know her very well, and he'd go grocery shopping for her. Paul McCartney would sit in the kitchen listening to stories, and she passes away, and Paul's a little down, and writes a song about basically that whole thing about Paul's meets an older lady, Daisy Hawkins. Goes shopping, hangs, chats. They just he's basically just doing the shopping, which maybe she can't do for whatever needs, essentials, groceries, and whatnot. And they're hanging out, spending lots of time chatting and talking, just being good friends and good humans. And he writes the song, and so there's a lot of songs like that of just like one of the Beatles hanging out, and they're inspired by those chats or an event song. So the Beatles wrote event music. They wrote songs about real people. Obviously, it's the song's not called Daisy Hawkins. It's called Eleanor Rigby, but it's about a real person. Yellow Submarine. I would say on this one, yes, like listen to the music. I would chant like. I would say I think the music's fabulous, but on Yellow Submarine, without spoiling everything, I would say make sure that you watch the actual video story. Now, of course, it would be awesome to have you watch the full video, like watch the video, eyes glued to the screen while listening. But it can be just as powerful to listen only, and it can also be just as powerful to just watch that video and kind of see what you get out of the story. So this is an intriguing thing we can do with music sometimes. There's not a right or wrong way. So on Rubber Soul 1965, this is where they get away from the Yeah, Yeah, Yeah songs. You get a very highly artistic album cover. And I always ask the question, I don't want to give you the answer, but what instrument do you hear in Norwegian wood that sounds different or eerie, or I'll just give it away, Norwegian wood, sitar, George Harrison playing the sitar. And I've already told you in my life with George Martin and the instrumental break and the keyboard, Bacchish or Baroque styled, inspired, excuse me. Socially relevant themes contained in the lyrics to Nowhere Man. And the big thing on Yesterday and Today, 1966, the cover art was a precursor to violent punk imagery. So take a look at that. If you get a chance to look at Revolver in 1966, this is around the same time that where John Lennon says, "We're more popular than Jesus." And then when you look up all the articles in the news, it's like people were burning and banning everything Beatles for a time. And then people forgive, not forget, but people, forgive, and maybe some people did forget too. If you look over to Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, these songs were like really nostalgic songs. And when we use the word nostalgic, we don't want to use it as a stereotypical thing. Like we need to like understand like nostalgia for all of us connects to something. So what I mean is Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, they are real places that they're actually singing about. The thing about the Sgt. Pepper album, this is around 67, and John Lennon meets Yoko Ono at a gallery opening. The Beatles attend around this time a lecture by Maharishi, Mahesh, Yogi. He becomes a big influence on their spiritual lives. They are with the Yogi when Brian Epstein dies of a drug overdose, and the Beatles are, of course, devastated. And basically, with Brian, the short story is like he just started getting depressed because the Beatles got so popular so quick. He's like, well, what do they need me for? Like he just started kind of overthinking, and he didn't know how much he was loved and appreciated. While the Beatles did tell him that, Brian just started kind of second guessing. So the Beatles were, they're out of town, trying to be enlightened, and they lose one of their best friends and their manager, and it was all just because Brian was, man, do they need me anymore? Like what am I doing here? Kind of thing. So, Sgt. Pepper was a critical and commercial smash hit. It's one of the first concept albums, but we can't forget about the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. These are two big ones, and I'll come back to these two albums in another lecture in American Music where I talk about concept albums. The Magical Mystery Tour, I Am the Walrus, that's a big one. The Beatles' White Album, you've heard me just mention them earlier, but now going through the details. With the White Album, basically, the cover is completely white. It's the title, it just says the Beatles, And it's got songs, like everybody writes a song, You got eclectic songs. It's all kinds of different songs in there. You take a look at Abbey Road, and it's like you got the continued musical excellence of, say, like Sgt. Pepper. You got George Harrison and Here Comes the Sun. They have, I Want You, Come Together. Abbey Road, probably the biggest selling Beatles album at the time of its release. The Beatles' White Album, this is probably, in 2021, it was 19 million sold. I'd have to double check for, our current year, but that's a lot. Now, there's other stories like the death of Paul and the breakup of the Beatles. So in 1969, there was rumors of messages in Beatles songs like Strawberry Fields Forever, Revolution Number 9, Blackbird, I'm So Tired. And it's like you play it backwards and there's like suspicion of McCartney's death. It was all, gossip and drama, hearsay, rumors, that kind of thing. Paul is, no, but Paul didn't die, Lennon and Ono also began to release music independently of the Beatles. Like Give Peace a Chance, and under the name The Plastic Ono Band. Let It Be is actually the last album. So Let It Be, this is basically pieced together by Phil Spector from various tracks recorded by the band members, and there was just editing and remixing them so that we could actually get this finals Beatles album, Let It Be. Some other things of note would be when they traveled in 1968 to study with Maharishi, and they kind of became disillusioned after a little bit, and they were like, okay, well, we're out of here. We're not feeling it anymore. Lennon divorces his wife Cynthia in 1968. He marries Yoko Ono. Of course, the public is stunned, and there's a lot of hoopla over that. On December 8th, 1980, John Lennon is murdered by Mark David Chapman outside his New York apartment. And yeah, what a real bummer. That was you can do more digging on that, but we lose one of the great lyricists of all time. One of our greatest musicians, lyricist, by some guy that was just fascinated and took him out, right outside his apartment, and yeah, not happy times, and we lost John too soon. There's a lot of anthology albums that have been released, say from like 1990s to the 2000s, and there's been some really significant commercial success. Beatlemania, it's simply this. Look, the appearance on that the Ed Sullivan Show. This is February 9th, 1964. It was the most watched television moment in history. Well, at least in those times anyway. And the band appeared on the show 3 times. The first time it was live. The second time also live, but it was broadcast from Miami, Florida. The third time was a recorded performance from their first New York visit. So the Beatles' appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show certainly qualify among the greatest moments in television history, and it does help to popularize Beatlemania in the United States of America. So what's up with the whole John, Paul McCartney duo thing that you see on YouTube or Apple Music or wherever you look at videos and music for anything to do with the Beatles? Well, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, they were the primary songwriters for the Beatles. And throughout the band's career, we're talking Ringo Starr, George Harrison, they did contribute songs to later albums, both Ringo and George. Lennon and McCartney really rank among the most prolific, talented, and successful songwriting teams of all time. The greatness of the songs that they wrote, inspired a near endless list of artists that have just gone on to record, versions after versions after versions, of their music. So basically, John and Paul just had a handshake deal. It didn't matter if John wrote the song or Paul wrote the song. Everything that they did, it always said, John Lennon and Paul McCartney, or Paul McCartney and John. It always had both of their names are attached to every single song. That's a pretty friendly, happy, awesome thing to do. So that's kind of why you're seeing that. It just all started out as a gentleman's handshake, and they stuck with that. Yay, awesome. I think that concludes the Beatles lecture. I really hope you enjoyed this. I'm Professor Ron. Enjoy your life. Enjoy the music. I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.